Prepper YouTube can be brilliant. It can get people thinking ahead, storing useful supplies, learning skills, and taking responsibility for themselves and their families. But let's be honest, it can also produce an astonishing amount of nonsense. And I don't just mean harmless eccentricity. I mean advice that is exaggerated, defeatist, badly thought through, or in some cases so stupid that if you actually followed it, you'd be worse off. So in this video, I want to go through some of the biggest myths, bad assumptions, and outright rubbish that can get repeated in prepper spaces, especially on YouTube, and look at what actually stands up to scrutiny. Myth number 1. 72 hours of blackout inevitably means without rule of law. One of the most common themes you hear from some prepper channels is that if the power goes out for a couple of days, that's basically it. Society breaks down, people start rioting, looting begins within hours, and we're off into some sort of Mad Max scenario. I think this is badly overstated. Now, I'm not saying that serious unrest can't happen. Of course it can. And I'm not saying that a prolonged nationwide grid failure would be a minor inconvenience. It absolutely would not. But the claim that 72 hours of blackout inevitably means without rule of law just does not hold up. April 2025, large parts of Spain and Portugal lost power after a major grid disturbance. Most areas were restored in well under a day, and while there was disruption, transport problems, and plenty of frustration, there was not some immediate descent into nationwide rioting and chaos. Then look at the Northeast blackout of 2003 in the US and Canada. That was caused by grid management failure, triggered by transmission line problems and software issues. Around 50 million people were affected. Most people got power back within a day or two, though some areas did take longer. And again, while there was disruption and some crime, it was nothing like the instant collapse people imagine. The Texas power crisis in 2021 was caused by extreme cold, generation issues, and problems across the power system. Some people were without power for days, and in some cases much longer. It was a humanitarian failure, and people undoubtedly suffered, but it wasn't a case of everyone immediately turning into roving looters. The 1989 Quebec blackout was triggered by a geomagnetic storm. Most of the province was back up within hours. Confusion, yes. Fear, yes, but not without rule of law. The Italy blackout of 2003 was caused by a cascade failure after issues on international transmission lines. Most of the country lost power. Again, major disruption, stranded passengers, inconvenience on a national scale, not instant social collapse. The Auckland CBD outage in 1998 lasted far longer, weeks rather than hours, caused by failures in underground power cables. But what followed was economic disruption and displacement rather than apocalyptic breakdown. And close to home, after Storm Éowyn in January 2025, some rural parts of Ireland were without power for extended periods because of storm damage to infrastructure. The response was much more about community resilience, generators, local help, and muddling through than immediate lawlessness. Now, people will point to the New York blackout of 1977, and fair enough, that one did see serious looting and disorder. But that's remembered precisely because it is the dramatic example, not because it's the universal rule. So what's the real lesson? Blackouts are serious. The longer they go on, the worse things get. And context matters enormously. Weather, existing social tensions, how widespread the outage is, what happens to water, communications and food disruptions, all of that matters. But the idea that a blackout of a few days automatically means nationwide without rule of law is just bad analysis. Prepare for blackouts properly, yes. But don't let people sell you a fantasy where every grid failure turns Britain into Mad Max by tea time. Myth number 2. Preparedness is all about breakdowns in society. This one kind of follows naturally from the first. I absolutely do think that it is valid to prepare for serious breakdowns in society. If you're thinking in terms of unrest, loss of order, disruptions to policing, supply breakdowns, regional disorder, even that very ugly worst case scenarios, that is part of preparedness. But what I object to is treating that as the default assumption, or worse, treating it as something to be relied upon. One well-known prepper suggested that 3 months of food is the most that makes sense to prep in the UK, because if you store more than that, you won't be able to keep hold of it. And another prepper, in a Blackout discussion, said that his plan was to go from house to house looting. That's not preparedness, it's fatalism mixed with fantasy. Yes, prepare for the possibility that society may break down, but do not assume it, and certainly do not rely on it. Because once you start assuming collapse as your default, your thinking gets warped. You stop asking sensible questions like, how do I make my home more resilient? How do I build longer term food and water and power resilience? How do I become less exposed to shortages? How do I stay safer, warmer, and more self-reliant over time? Instead, you end up mentally living in a permanent end of the world film. And the real world usually isn't like that. Take the pandemic. That was a long-running crisis. Many of us used our preps. We relied more on stored food, backup supplies, and resilience measures. There were shortages, delays, anxiety, and disruption, but it was not without rule of law. It was exactly the sort of thing where long-term preparedness makes sense. If you'd listened to the defeatist line that there's no point storing more than a few months of food because someone will just take it, you would have been engaging in learned helplessness. The sensible position is this. Prepare for breakdowns in society. They can happen, and in some places they do. But do not assume them, and certainly do not rely on them as part of your plan. Your preparedness should still make sense in the much more common world of shortages, disruption, uncertainty, local disruption, and long, awkward crises that fall well short of total collapse. And if your grand strategy to survival starts with looting your neighbours, you're not really describing preparedness at all. You're describing the sort of person your neighbours need to be prepared for. Myth number 3. Mainstream media has bias. Therefore, the random Telegram feed must be telling the truth. This one matters because it affects how people understand the risk in the first place. You'll often hear preppers say some version of BBC is biased, Sky is biased, the mainstream media is pushing an agenda. Now, bias in mainstream media absolutely exists. Of course it does. Different outlets frame stories differently, emphasise different facts, bring in different experts, and have different institutional assumptions. But the leap some people then make from that to, therefore, this random Telegram channel, Facebook post, or Kremlin-sponsored nonsense must be the real truth, is ridiculous. Because yes, mainstream media has bias. But do you really think that means there is no bias in some anonymous social media feed? No manipulation in state-backed propaganda? No agenda in that bloke endlessly sharing what they don't want you to know clips? Come off it. There's a useful comparison here. Most people think that they are a better than average driver. Statistically, that can't be true for everyone. And I think something similar happens with information. Most people think they are better than average at spotting lies and propaganda. They think they are the clever ones who see through all the spin, while all the sheep are fooled. But that can't be true for everyone either. And the techniques used by professional propagandists are such that they will influence the average person. That's the whole point. They're good at what they do. And this problem is only going to get worse AI-generated content, deep fakes, more sophisticated disinformation, more targeted algorithmic bubbles. It's becoming easier and easier to build a weird little fantasy reality around people. You can often see it when arguing with someone who's fallen into one of these information bubbles. They're no longer just skeptical of the mainstream. They've been dragged into an entire parallel world of make-believe. At least mainstream outlets usually have some combination of professional journalists, access to experts, editors, corrections, public scrutiny. And they don't need the reputational damage that's going to come with consistently pointing out the wrong thing. That doesn't make them perfect, but it does make them different from some random channel pumping out propaganda and calling it truth. So here is the sensible rule of thumb. For most people, probably all people, mainstream news should make up the majority of your news media diet. Be critical, yes. Compare sources, yes. But don't flatter yourself that because you dislike the BBC, that you're therefore immune to manipulation from far worse actors. A lot of people in prepper circles are rightly alert to propaganda from governments and big institutions. Good, they should be. But their scepticism has to apply in both directions, and not just where it flatters their own bias. Myth number 4. If things go really bad, you can just bug out and live off the land. This idea crops up all the time in survival discussions, even if, to be fair, YouTube preppers don't always push it as hard as some of the forums do. The fantasy goes something like this. Society collapses, you grab your bag, head to the countryside and live off hunting, fishing and foraging. Sometimes people talk as if they're going to pick up a bow and arrow and start feeding themselves from the British wilderness. This is fantasy. First, hunting, fishing, trapping and foraging are all difficult skills. Not impossible, but difficult. They take time, practice, local knowledge, and a lot of trial and error. Even people who already do these things seriously do not generally feed themselves entirely from these wild resources. Second, the UK is not some empty frontier full of untouched abundance. Wild food sources are limited. Wildlife numbers are limited. Fish stocks are limited. And access to the land is limited. Legal restrictions are real. And if lots of people suddenly got the same idea, those resources would get hammered very quickly. Even now, with modern gear and a functioning society, most people cannot just wander off and live from hunting and fishing. So what chance does average Joe have under stress, with patchy skills, competing against goodness knows how many others with the same fantasy? Not much. And the same basic criticism applies to fishing. Some people imagine that they're just going to head to a river, canal or coastline and pull calories out of the water indefinitely. But even experienced anglers do not reliably feed themselves that way. And if large numbers of desperate people tried, those stocks would disappear very fast. Third, surviving outdoors long term is much harder than people imagine. Exposure, wet, illness, bad shelter, poor sleep, injury and calorie deficit will ruin people a lot faster than the fantasy suggests. Learning to be more comfortable and capable outdoors is a good thing. But the idea that large numbers of people are going to bug out into the countryside and successfully live off the land is nonsense. For most people, realistic preparedness is much more about staying where you are and riding out the disruption, not disappearing into the woods with a bow like some kind of apocalyptic Robin Hood. Myth number 5, cash will be king and precious metals will be even better. You hear this a lot in prepper circles. The idea is that when things go wrong, the banking system stops working, electronic payments fail, and suddenly cash becomes king. And if you're really switched on, you'll have gold and silver as well. Now, there is a grain of truth here. Cash can absolutely be useful in short-term disruptions. If card machines go down, internet access fails, or payment systems are patchy, having some cash can make life a lot easier. But that doesn't mean that cash automatically becomes king in every crisis. Some prepper channels claim that supermarkets will simply close if the system is disrupted. I find that very hard to believe. In most real crises, shops try very hard to stay open. That's how they make money. And it's also how societies keep food moving to where people live. What usually happens instead is disruption. Shelves empty faster than they can be restocked. Certain products disappear for a while and queues get longer. We saw this during the pandemic. Some items vanished temporarily and people experienced empty shelves for the first time in years. But the supermarkets themselves did not disappear. Even during the Second World War, when Britain was being bombed and supply ships were being sunk in the Atlantic, shops did not simply shut down. Instead, the country introduced rationing. People queued, choice was reduced, and supply was constrained. But the retail system kept operating. Now, yes, modern supply chains rely heavily on just-in-time logistics, and shops do not keep huge stockpiles in the back. That means shelves can empty quickly when demand spikes. But those same systems are also extremely good at restocking. Inventory is tracked in real time. Deliveries can be redirected. Supply chains are vulnerable in some ways, but they're also highly responsive in ways that older systems were not. So in many realistic crises, the problem is not that shops vanish completely. It's that supplies become limited, unpredictable, and temporarily unavailable. And that brings us to precious metals. In a genuine emergency, most people are not going to start weighing out silver coins in supermarket queue. Day-to-day trade still depends on recognised currency systems, not improvised bullion markets. Historically, gold and silver tend to matter more when some degree of stability is returning and formal economic life is being rebuilt. During the immediate crisis itself, what people actually need are food, water, medicine, and useful goods. So yes, keeping some cash is sensible. But the idea that stacks of banknotes or a bag of silver coins will automatically solve your problems in a crisis is largely a myth. Myth number 6, tactical cosplay. Now we get to one of the funniest corners of prepper culture, tactical cosplay. You know the sort of thing I mean. People dressing as if every likely emergency in Britain will involve them patrolling a post-apocalyptic wasteland in full combat kit, covered in molly, with a plate carrier, 6 pouches, and enough tactical nylon to invade Belgium. Now let me be fair here. Some tactical gear is genuinely useful, and I love it. Military surplus can be durable, webbing can work, good boots matter, a decent rucksack matters. Weatherproof clothing matters. Torches, gloves, pouches, and load carrying kit all have their place. That's not the issue. The issue is when people stop thinking in terms of what problem am I solving and start thinking in terms of how can I look like the sort of bloke who solves problems. That's also where preparedness starts drifting into costume. Because most realistic UK emergencies do not require you to look like you're about to clear a trench system in Donetsk. They require much duller things. Can you carry water? Can you stay warm? Can you charge your phone? Can you cook? Can you walk home in the bad weather? Can you keep a low profile if needed? Can you avoid looking like the person carrying the most expensive loot in the room? And this is where tactical cosplay can become actively counterproductive. Because if you wander around in a crisis, looking heavily kitted up, you may not look capable. You may just look conspicuous. You may look like someone worth robbing. Or like someone trying far, far too hard. Or like someone who's built their entire idea of preparedness around YouTube thumbnails and action films. Preparedness should be practical. If a bit of military kit genuinely suits the job, great, use it. But if your emergency setup looks more like fancy dress rehearsal for a civil war than a sensible plan for getting through a British disruption, you may have drifted off course. Myth 7. The grey man obsession. Now, the flip side of tactical cosplay is the grey man obsession. This is the idea that in a crisis, your highest goal is to become so bland, so forgettable, and so aggressively average that nobody notices you at all. Again, there's a grain of truth here. Not drawing unnecessary attention to yourself is often sensible. Looking normal can absolutely be an advantage. Not advertising expensive kit is sensible. Blending into the local environment, dressing appropriately for where you are, and not screaming, "I have gear," from 50 yards away, all of that makes sense. But as usual, Prepper YouTube takes the sensible core and runs off into the bushes with it. Because some people talk as if the key to survival is to become this mysterious, invisible urban operative in a beige fleece and neutral day pack, going unnoticed through the chaos because they have mastered the sacred art of looking boring. Come on. In real life, what makes you stand out is not the colour of your jacket. It's your behaviour. Are you acting weirdly? Are you visibly scared? Are you carrying yourself like someone hiding something? Are you wearing clothes that don't fit the place, the weather, or the people around you? That matters a lot more than whether your bag is coyote tan or navy blue. And there's another problem with the grey man idea. People often use it as an excuse to avoid useful gear altogether. They talk as if anything remotely sturdy, practical, or outdoorsy is a giveaway, and the only safe option is to look like you're heading to Costa with a laptop and emotional fragility. Again, nonsense. You do not need to look tactical, but neither do you need to turn yourself into an accountant-shaped ghost. The real rule is much simpler. Look normal for your environment, carry what you need, and don't advertise more than necessary. That's it. So tactical cosplay and grey man obsession are really two sides of the same problem. One says preparedness means looking like a commando. The other says preparedness means performing blandness like an undercover actor in your own life. In reality, both are overthought. Dress for the task, dress for the place, dress for the weather. And stop imagining that your survival will hinge on whether your fleece is sufficiently anonymous. Myth number 8. EMP will fry all electronics instantly. A sufficiently powerful electromagnetic pulse can absolutely damage electronic systems. That's not fantasy. But Prepper YouTube often treats EMP as a magical off button. One pulse, one flash, and apparently every car, phone, torch, solar panel, radio, battery bank and laptop in the country is instantly dead forever. That's not a serious way to think about it, because vulnerability to EMP is not uniform. It depends on what caused the pulse, how strong it is, how far away you are, whether the device is connected to long wires or infrastructure, how the device is built, how it's positioned. In some cases, the same item rotated 90 degrees will have a different outcome, because the way the pulse couples into a device depends partly on orientation and exposed conductors. That alone should tell you we're not dealing with some sort of mystical all or nothing force field. Large connected systems are generally the bigger concern. Grid infrastructure, long transmission lines, telecoms networks, and anything tied into extensive wiring are much more plausible points of failure than every random gadget in your drawer. Small, self-contained electronics may be vulnerable, but many will also survive, especially if they're unplugged, completely disconnected, and simply not exposed in the worst possible way. That does not mean ignore the risk. It means think about it properly. The sensible takeaway is that not all electronics are doomed. It's that some electronics may survive, some may not, and large connected infrastructure is a much bigger worry than every loose torch and USB power bank. If you're concerned, a bit of redundancy and some shielding for key items is reasonable. But this idea that one pulse turns the whole country into the 18th century overnight is mostly YouTube drama. Myth number 9. A few nukes would wipe out the UK. Nuclear weapons are horrific. A nuclear war involving the UK would be a national catastrophe. I'm not downplaying that for a second. But people often talk about nuclear weapons as if they're giant map delete buttons. And if a handful of warheads would simply erase the whole country and everyone in it. That's not how it works. Blast damage from a nuclear weapon is devastating, but it's limited by distance. Thermal effects are severe, but not infinite. And fallout, which most people talk about as if it's some sort of even blanket of death over the whole country, depends a lot on the kind of burst, the target, the weather, and especially the wind. A ground burst tends to create much more fallout than an air burst. Shelter matters enormously, and so does distance, and so does the wind. I remember one well-known prepper saying there was no point preparing for nuclear war because he lived between 3 likely targets. He even gave rough distances to them, which meant I was able to work out within a few kilometres roughly where he meant. So I checked a nuclear blast simulator online, and the result was interesting. Even if all 3 of those targets took direct hits, he would probably survive those blasts. Now, that does not mean he would be fine. Far from it. It means the exact opposite of what he was claiming. It means that there would very much be a point in preparing, because survival is not the same thing as comfort, safety, or a function in society. And that's before you even get to the other uncertainties. There's nothing saying all 3 sites would actually be targeted. Nothing saying that every missile would arrive on target. And nothing saying that every warhead would function as intended. People talk about nuclear war as if it's a perfect computer simulation where every strike lands exactly where planned and every device performs flawlessly. Real life is messier than that. And then there's the nuclear winter issue, which gets thrown around as if it settles the whole argument. There are serious scientific arguments about climactic effects from large-scale nuclear war. I'm not dismissing that. But YouTube often uses nuclear winter in a very lazy way, as if any exchange at all means the sky goes black, agriculture ends everywhere, and all preparation is pointless. That's not a serious conclusion. The scale of climactic effects depends massively on the number of detonations, the targets hit, how many cities burn, how much soot is injected high into the atmosphere, and for how long. In other words, it's not some automatic on-off switch where 1 or 2 strikes on Britain means instant extinction. And if someone is going to start quoting Annie Jacobsen at me, I refer you to the earlier discussion about your media diet. So yes, if the UK were hit by nuclear weapons, the consequences would be appalling. Cities or bases directly hit would suffer mass death and devastation. There would be fires, panic, overwhelmed hospitals, damaged infrastructure, communications failures, contamination, and probably cascading breakdowns across the country. But that's very different from saying the whole of the UK would simply be wiped out. A great many people outside direct strike zones would survive the initial attack. That doesn't mean they would be okay. It means that then they face the ugly part. Damaged infrastructure, fallout in some areas, overwhelmed medical services, supply chain collapse, communications disruption, financial breakdown, fear, confusion, and political chaos. That is what makes nuclear war so dangerous. Not that it magically kills everyone at once, but that it creates a hideous survival situation for the people left behind. And this matters because some preppers talk as if nuclear preparedness is pointless, as if either you're vaporized or you're not, so there's nothing sensible to do. That's wrong. Basic preparations like shelter in knowledge, the ability to stay indoors, some food and water, awareness of fallout timing, and not doing something idiotic in those first critical hours could make a very large difference. So the sensible position is not nukes are no big deal. It's this. Nuclear war would be dreadful, but preppers often overestimate the immediate area of destruction, underestimate how many people would survive the initial attacks, and then use exaggerated ideas about blast and nuclear winter to talk themselves into helplessness. Myth number 10, you don't need to rotate stored tap water. This is one of those smug little prepper talking points that sounds clever right until you think about it for about 30 seconds. A well-known prepper was implying there's no need to rotate stored tap water after 6 months or a year, and that if someone says you do, you should ask them why. Fine, ask them why. The answer is not that water magically expires like milk, and it's not that your stored tap water turns evil because the calendar moved on. The reason is much simpler. Tap water is chlorinated when you store it, but that chlorine residual does not stay there forever. Over time, it dissipates. Some of it reacts with tiny amounts of organic matter or contamination in the water or the container. Some of it reacts with container surfaces or cap materials. And some of it slowly escapes from the water into the air, especially if the seal isn't perfect. And warmth can speed up the whole process. So over time, the chlorine residual falls and the water gradually loses the disinfectant protection it had when it came out of the tap. That does not mean the water becomes instantly unsafe after some magical deadline. It means the longer you leave it, the less you're relying on active disinfection and the more you're relying on everything else having gone right. The container having been properly cleaned, the seal staying sound, no contamination being introduced when you filled it, no contamination getting in later, decent storage conditions, no heat, light, dirt or damage compromising the setup. So when someone says in that smug little tone, ask them why, there's your answer. Because the chlorine protection does not last forever, and preparedness is not about winning clever little internet arguments. It's about reducing uncertainty. And rotation discipline helps with that. It helps you know what you actually have, where it is, and what condition it's in. If you rotate your stored water, you're not just refreshing the contents. You're keeping the whole system alive in your mind. You're noticing leaks, damaged containers, dodgy seals, bad storage conditions, and whether your supposed stored water is actually still there and usable. Rotation's not just about the water itself. It's about checking the whole system. Are the containers still sound? Are the caps intact? Has anything leaked? Has anything gone cloudy? Do you still trust what you stored? Or are you now emotionally attached to the idea that it must be fine because you can't be bothered to revisit it? That's the real issue. So no, stored tap water does not suddenly go off on a date. But acting as if rotation is pointless and anyone who mentions it is repeating nonsense is exactly the sort of smug half-truth prepper YouTube is full of. A more sensible view is this. Stored tap water can last a good while if done properly, but the chlorine residual declines over time and rotation remains a perfectly sensible way to maintain confidence in what you have stored. Myth number 11. Authorities will confiscate your supplies. The idea is that if things get serious, the authorities will inevitably come round, confiscating everyone's food, water, generators, fuel, and everything else useful. Therefore, the logic goes, there's no point storing much, or at least no point being open about it. Now, let's be fair. Governments can seize things in some circumstances. States can requisition buildings, fuel, vehicles, land, equipment, and all sorts of asset under emergency powers or wartime arrangements. That's real. But Prepper YouTube often takes that grain of truth and inflates it into a fantasy, where the moment there's a crisis, some clipboard warrior appears at your semi-detached in Blackburn to confiscate your bottled water and tins of beans. That is not a serious analysis. Because in most realistic emergencies, the authorities are not trying to strip households bare. They're trying to keep order, restore services, move resources at scale, and stop panic. And frankly, in a country like Britain, going door to door to seize ordinary family emergency supplies would be wildly impractical, politically toxic, and counterproductive. Why would you want to confiscate the very supplies that are helping households remain calm, fed, and less dependent on the state? If anything, from the government's point of view, households with some food, water, torches, medicines, and backup power are part of the buffer that makes a crisis easier to manage. Now, could there be exceptions? Yes. Could some specific things be restricted, rationed, requisitioned, or regulated in certain emergencies? Of course. But that's very different from the blanket Prepper claim that the authorities will confiscate your supplies. Usually what people mean is one of three things. Authorities may control or ration key goods. Visible stockpiles might attract attention from other people, or they have a general suspicion of the state and have let that suspicion run ahead of reality. These are not all the same thing, and this myth can become actively harmful because it encourages defeatism and silly behaviour. People start telling themselves there's no point building deeper supplies, no point improving resilience, no point investing in backup systems, because they'll just take it anyway. That's the same learned helplessness we've already talked about. And it often becomes an excuse for secrecy for the sake of secrecy, or not doing proper preparedness at all. The sensible position is much simpler. Don't advertise your supplies unnecessarily. Do not be stupid. Do not assume every official response will be wise or proportionate. But also do not build your entire preparedness philosophy around a fantasy of inevitable confiscation. Because in most plausible crises, the far bigger risk is not that the government seizes your beans. It's that you never stored any beans in the first place, because some bloke on YouTube convinced you there was no point. Myth number 12. In self-defense, focus entirely on the knife. A group of preppers were discussing knife defense and saying that if someone has a knife, you should focus entirely on the knife, grab the weapon arm with both hands, and basically make that the whole fight. Now let's start with the obvious. If someone has a knife, the knife matters a lot. You would be an idiot to ignore it. And controlling the weapon-bearing limb, if you realistically can, is obviously relevant. So this is not one of those myths where the whole thing is nonsense. The myth is the word entirely. Because once you say focus entirely on the knife, you're already starting to drift into dangerous oversimplification. A real violent encounter is not a neat little drill. The attacker is not a floating knife hand waiting to be managed. He has another hand. He may be punching, grabbing, headbutting, driving into you, shoving you into obstacles, dragging you to the floor, or simply stabbing repeatedly in a chaotic burst. And even if you do manage to control the knife hand, that's not the end of the problem. He may grab the knife with the other hand. He may switch hands. Or he may have another weapon anyway. That is part of the problem with reducing the whole encounter to one tidy little slogan. If you grab the weapon arm with both hands and mentally reduce the whole event to "I must control the knife," you may neglect everything else that's happening around you. I was rather hoping the Arya Stark and the Night King scene might have killed this myth off, but apparently not. Because yes, even in fantasy TV, people have grasped the basic point that one hand holding a weapon does not mean that weapon stays there forever. The broader truth is that knife defense is ugly, chaotic, and unreliable. There's no magic technique. There's no clean, do this one thing and you will win. The goals are messier than that. Avoid if you can. Escape if you can. Use barriers if you can. Use improvised weapons if you can. Create distance and disrupt the attacker. Control the weapon arm if the opportunity is there, but don't imagine that that one principle replaces the rest of the fight. A chair, a backpack, a bin, a stick, a bottle, a torch, or even just something that gives you reach, distraction, or a barrier may matter a lot more than some fantasy about perfectly pinning the knife arm with both hands while the rest of the attacker politely ceases to exist. Myth number 13. Batteries are obsolete, now we have USB. The claim is that because so many devices now recharge by USB, ordinary batteries are now basically old hat. You do not need to bother with AA, AAA and the rest anymore, because everything can run off power banks, rechargeable torches, USB lanterns, and built-in lithium batteries. There's a grain of truth in this. USB charge gear is genuinely useful. Power banks are brilliant. Rechargeable lanterns, head torches, radios and fans can all make excellent sense. And if you're building resilience in the modern world, USB power obviously deserves a major place in the system. But batteries are not obsolete at all. They're still a key part of the power picture. And in some cases, they're still the better answer. Why? Because removable batteries give you flexibility. They let you swap power instantly. They let you stock energy in a simple, shelf-stable form that's generally quite cheap. They let you run multiple devices without waiting for recharge cycles. And they often let you keep going when your lovely USB ecosystem has developed to a point of failure. Because USB systems do have failure points. You need cables, you need ports, you need charging time, and you need the internal battery in the device to still be healthy. You may need a power bank that itself needs recharging. And if the built-in battery fails in a sealed device, your clever modern gadget can become a little brick. Whereas with the device that takes ordinary batteries, you can often just put fresh ones in and carry on. That matters. It matters in blackouts, it matters in cold weather, it matters when lending gear out, and it matters when you want simple redundancy. Preparedness is not about choosing one fashionable system and declaring the old one dead. It's about layered resilience. A USB torch is useful, and a torch that takes common batteries is also useful. Use rechargeables where appropriate, keep disposables as backup, and maintain a simple system. That's not obsolete, it's practical. The sensible conclusion is not USB bad, and it's not batteries bad. It's this. USB charging is a very useful layer of modern resilience, but declaring ordinary batteries obsolete is just another example of people mistaking newer for better in every situation. In preparedness, boring old batteries are still doing quite a lot of work. Myth number 14, the manual can opener myth. This one is less a full statement and more a massively over-laboured prepper cliche. You hear it constantly. Make sure you have a manual can opener. And yes, fine, have a manual can opener. But let's be honest here. In the UK, this is not exactly a staggering revelation. Most households already have several. Hardly anyone has gone over to some all-electric can opening lifestyle. Electronic can openers are not exactly dominating British kitchens, They exist, obviously, but they're nowhere near common enough for remember to own a manual can opener to count as some kind of profound piece of preparedness wisdom. So when prepper channels keep hammering this point as if they're passing on ancient survival knowledge, it starts to sound a bit silly. Yes, if all your food storage is tinned, it would be stupid not to have a manual can opener. But for most people, this is a problem that's already long been solved. The manual can opener is already in the drawer. It's not like water storage, backup power, medical supplies, insulation, sanitation, or any of the things that people genuinely neglect. It's a basic kitchen item that people already own. And that's what makes it a myth in prepper spaces, not because the advice is wrong, but because the emphasis is absurdly out of proportion to the insight. It's like solemnly informing British adults that they may wish to own a kettle. True, yes. Worth saying over and over in grave tones as if civilization depends on it. Not really. So the sensible version is, yes, have a manual can opener, but please stop pretending this is some kind of great overlooked secret of preparedness, especially in a country where most people already have one. Myth number 15. Urinate in a hot water bottle. This is one of those bits of survival advice that sounds so grimly ingenious that people repeat it just for the satisfaction of sounding hard. The idea is simple enough. If you're cold at night, urinate into a bottle and use it as a heat source. Now, to be fair, there's a small amount of truth buried in this one as well. Fresh urine is warm. And so, yes, a bottle of warm liquid will contain some heat for a while. That part is not magic. It's just thermodynamics. But people then leap from that tiny truth as if they've discovered some rugged field expedient substitute for a proper hot water bottle. They have not. A real hot water bottle starts properly hot. Urine starts at roughly body temperature. So from the beginning, it has much less heat to give you. And in a cold environment, that small advantage disappears very quickly. And before anyone says it, yes, urine is usually sterile when it leaves the body. Fine. That still does not make this a clever routine. Because once it's sitting in a bottle in your sleep system, you're no longer discussing it in that neat little laboratory sense people love to bring up online. You're talking about a warm organic fluid in your sleeping area. If that leaks, if the cap fails, if you fumble it in the dark, or if your bottle was not as suitable as you imagined, you've not created comfort. You've turned your sleeping area into a petri dish. And the real problem with advice like this, it takes some narrow technical point and inflates it into a clever sounding habit when the obvious alternatives are better, cleaner, and more effective. If you're cold at night, the real answers are things like a better sleep system, better insulation underneath you, drier clothing, shelter from drafts, or an actual bottle of genuinely hot water. That's not less hardcore, it's just less stupid. So yes, in some desperate edge case, could a bottle of warm urine briefly contain warmth? Sure. But for almost everybody hearing this advice, the sensible advice is, if you want the benefits of a hot water bottle, use a hot water bottle. If you're cold at night, improve your sleep system. Do not act as if urinating into a bottle is some great breakthrough in preparedness. So, I've been through a few of the myths that are pervasive within the YouTube and wider prepper community. Which ones did I miss? What other things have you heard along those lines? Or do you want to come back on any of these points and try to justify them? Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to our next video.